which is the title of a recent book I wrote. And it's basically about a reliability engineering framework for security. The reason behind the title is I'm going to make the argument in the talk that the most secure environment is actually a environment that's relatively silent. And in order to do that, let's take a look at a little bit of history first. So this is a process that started back in 2015. This is when I started to take a look at security from an empirical mindset. I wanted to actually sit down and measure what worked about security and what didn't work. And one of the ways I did that was by developing, at the time, a Perl script that leveraged the ICAR test string to simulate malware propagation on my network. Now, keep in mind, this was back in 2015. No one was doing these types of live fire simulation tests. And what I did is I figured out and mapped out all the pathways that malware could spread through my organization. And I used that to develop a highly segmented network that became a model for being one of the first zero trust networks in healthcare in the world. And a little historical context, this is a picture of me on stage in 2016 at OWASP New York City talking about the methodology that I developed. It was a precursor to modern day breach and attack simulation, as well as modern day attack path management. Because I basically used a simulated malware to measure the attack paths within the organization. And what this talk really is this is the 11-year evolution of this idea, starting with that principle of measuring control efficacy, measuring how attacks can propagate through an organization, and refining that methodology into a formalized engineering framework over the last 11 years. Okay, for anyone interested, I put a link to a timeline that covers this history on this slide. Now, one of the things is a funnel like this is not too uncommon today. I'm sure most of you have seen a CISO present a funnel like this to the board, where it shows a ingestion rate of a high number of alerts and a high number of logs. Those logs generate a high number of alerts. The staff goes and triages the large number of those alerts to bring the account down, and you wade through all those alerts to look at a much smaller number of incidents. Now, most people show this as a sign of success. They look at it, wow, look at all my team is doing. Look at all these alerts we're processing. I'm going to make the argument today that this is not a sign of success. These alert funnels are actually a testament to bad architecture. I believe that high alert volume is not a sign of maturity. It's just evidence that too many attack paths still exist within the environment. When you have this many alerts, SOC burnout becomes a mathematical inevitability. When you're alerting constantly, you have alerts going off all the time. Finding that one true positive critical becomes finding a needle in a haystack. It's not a good way to identify things, and eventually you're bound to miss one critical alert, which results in an incident. It's not a good situation to be in. And what we're doing in this kind of case is we're approaching security not by preventing things from happening, but we're trying to solve security problems through detection and triage as soon as something happens. It's a very reactive stance to security. And I think we need to switch to a much more proactive focus in how we secure things. A alert funnel like this does not represent security. It just represents a lot of activity and a lot of architectural debt within an organization. Now, if we begin to look at things from a reliability engineering standpoint instead, we notice that reliability engineering takes a very different approach to how it approaches things. Now, if we're talking about an airplane, your nuclear reactor, any kind of safety critical system, how these engineering disciplines operate is they, A, identify failure modes, B, they eliminate those failure modes, C, they constrain failure modes that they cannot fully eliminate, and only monitor what cannot be eliminated as a last resort. But in cybersecurity, we kind of invert this order. We skip straight to monitoring. We're concerned with monitoring stuff, detection. We're concerned with scoring things. We're building executive dashboards around things. But we don't spend anywhere near enough time talking about elimination and constraint. And any other engineering discipline, detection is not a primary safety mechanism. It's evidence that a primary safety mechanism has already failed. And I argue this holds true for security. Going back to my comments about that funnel, every one of those alerts means an architectural constraint was violated. The safety mechanisms has already failed. That's why an alert is allowed to trigger within the environment. And that's something that we need to change if we want to make our organizations more secure over time. To kind of put this in terms of an analogy that's a little more easy to understand, is given that security today is very, very concerned with detection and response, we're kind of like the fire department is to any kind of building structure. When an alarm goes off, just like the fire department, we go, we respond to the call, we try to put the fire out in time, hopefully before the building burns to the ground. What I'm arguing for is that we need to stop spending so much time trying to become a better and better fire department. Not because the fire department's bad in any way, but because it's much more productive to spend time building a building that's not flammable in the first place. Rather than constantly waiting for the building to detect fire and putting up more smoke alarms, which are like security tools, I'm arguing that we should focus on architecture instead. Make a building out of stone, get rid of all the things that can cause the building to catch fire in the first place. That's where we need to shift our focus to over time. And we do that by eliminating attack paths. If we go back to our reliability engineering analogy, the argument that I make throughout this whole talk is that attack paths are failure modes. They're the cybersecurity equivalent. So one of the things we need to do is we need to begin to first eliminate and then constrain the attack paths within our environment. And we can do this through a variety of controls, things like least privilege, segmentation, stronger authentication. And the more and more we apply these types of rules to our environment, the fewer fires we get over time, the fewer alerts we get. And this has a very interesting proactive pivot to it, in that the more and more of these architectural constraints we begin to put in, the less alerts you get, the less SOC fatigue you get, the lower costs you get because you need to ingest less logs. And you begin to put a lot of the time that you reclaim formally responding to those alerts into engineering, and it kind of snowballs into allowing your organization to become much more secure over time. Now, in order to do this, one of the things I'm a proponent of is applying controls in a hierarchy of efficacy. And if you notice, this matches the same type of approach a reliability engineering framework takes. At the base of the pyramid is our primary control plane. These should be architectural controls that outright eliminate things that cause risk to the environment. These are things like legacy protocols that are no longer in use, things that we can completely delete from the environment because no one has a legitimate use for them anymore. Things like turning off SMB version 1, things like eliminating unnecessary egress, taking away local admin privileges from the average user workstation. These are functionalities that we can fully strip out of the environment because no one needs them. Level 2 is constraint. These are things that we cannot get rid of entirely, but we can put constraints around to prevent the failure mode from manifesting in a lot of ways. Take, for example, things like Microsoft Office. Microsoft Office normally has no legitimate reason to spawn a command prompt or spawn PowerShell. So we can't eliminate Microsoft Office from the environment. That would obviously break a business process, but we can put architectural constraints around it by preventing that Office application from launching those potentially malicious child processes. So, step 1, eliminate what we can. Step 2, constrain what we can't eliminate. And in this hierarchy, detection response, which is where we put almost all our focus today in security, it still plays a critical role, but it's much less reduced in capacity. We only monitor the things that we cannot eliminate and cannot constrain. And this is part of why you get much less alerts and a more easy to manage SOC, because once you eliminate, let's say, WScript from the environment, there's never going to be an alert for WScript again, unless there's an architectural failure that re-enables it. And you eliminate whole classes of alerts that way. You make the environment much quieter, and everything becomes much more productive within the organization. So it's basically flipping the script. Today, we take the opposite approach. We put all our time into detection response and a lot less into architecture. I'm arguing we need to start doing the reverse. And more time needs to go into architecture with less and less focus on detection and response. And one of the reasons for this is I think we've all kind of, as industry, make a hidden assumption. Today, we treat vulnerabilities as if they're risk. And you can see a lot of the fear with this with Claude Mythos and a lot of the frontier adversarial AI models coming out. Everybody's worried about all the huge vulnerability counts coming out. But if we look at things from an attack path perspective, we can start to see that one of the things that really counts is vulnerabilities really only matter if they're part of an attack path. So, for example, most real world attacks, it's something like you have initial access, then you have, somebody looking for credentials and try to get local admin, to then try to laterally move to control AD. Maybe there's some egress involved as well. There's a variety of steps an attack has to launch in order to complete. So from this kind of perspective, a vulnerability without a path is really just noise. And going back to that attack paths or failure modes, risk lives in graphs, not CVEs. And it's the attack paths that make up those graphs throughout the organization. So my whole model is based around path erasure. So path erasure it's a model for the deliberate removal of trust relationships, implicit privilege transfers, lateral movement opportunities, exploit chaining surfaces. And it's a way to proactively break a lot of those paths within the organization. The whole idea behind the subtractive approach to security is to begin to change the geometry of that attack graph. If you start getting rid of all of the edges that attackers can exploit, you dramatically reduce the geometry of the attack path, you reduce attacker optionality. And this is the way I think security needs to begin to behave. So to kind of give an example, let's say something like you have a browser. Your typical browser, like a Chrome or Edge, they have 0 days and patches available for them all the time. But if we begin to take a more subtractive approach and put rules in place to prevent the browser from launching, PowerShell or WMI or command prompt or whatever malicious child process that we could possibly think of, if we block those child processes, the patch suddenly becomes a lot less critical, because even if the user was to click a phishing link and launch the exploit has nowhere to go because the architectural constraint will kick in and prevent the attack path from proceeding to the next step. And this is the kind of thinking that we need to take more and more long term. We need to figure out ways that we can break these paths to make the growing number of vulnerabilities that all these frontier AI models are producing much less impactful. We want to mitigate things proactively and before a vulnerability comes into the equation. Another little deeper example of this. So, a lot of organizations, code execution equals lateral movement. Once the attacker gets that click or gets the user to open the Office document with the phishing thing, they get code execution on the user's desktop. They use the execution to pivot to higher administrative privileges, use that to invoke lateral movement, and suddenly that one malicious click turns into a compromised network or network segment within an organization. If we take the more subtractive security approach and look at path erasure, there's a lot of different ways in which we can begin to break up an attack path like that. So for example, we could prevent user-facing apps like we just discussed in the browser or Office from ever launching those child processes. We could enforce child process allow lists. We can enforce network policies that control what different processes can do. We can remove implicit trust between execution contexts and network movements. And this gives us the key insight that execution is an event, but movement is a privilege. So we can actually use path erasure to make it so that even if the exploit could not be patched, we still remove the ability for that to be used as an edge to progress the attack within the network. And that's more in line with what we have to be thinking going forward. And one of the ways I'm big on doing this is using the evidence-based security framework that I published back in 2020. So I believe that, and this kind of has its roots in the Perl script I mentioned on the first slide. I've always been big on measuring control efficacy and very big on answering the question, does this security work? And an interesting historical note of why I went down this direction is when I ran that 2015 Perl script to measure the spread of malware through my organization, one of the things I learned from doing that simulation was that we actually had a segmented network and our segmentation worked. But from running the script, we learned that the segmentation we had in place was actually nowhere near effective enough. So we were segmented by department, which exceeded any hospital compliance standard at the time. It was actually better than the vast majority of hospitals had, but it still wasn't enough. Because if ransomware would actually come through the organization and we lost our whole emergency room, our whole radiology department, or another critical care department, it was still going to shut the hospital down. So we had a control, we had to work in control, but we had a control that nowhere near had the efficacy that we actually needed in order to keep the business operations running during a real attack. And over time, this got me very interested in figuring out how I could measure efficacy of the controls I had in my environment. So about 6 years ago, I published the evidence-based security framework. And what this does is it allows you to take an attacker TTP. So you're going to take that, and that's your mapping phase. You figure out what threat you want to assess, what TTPs are relevant, and then you define some metrics around what you want to measure with that attack. And I always define that as the null result. For me, the only metric that should count when running some kind of attack simulation is that the attack doesn't work. I think one of the big issues that a lot of breach and attack simulation companies make today, one of the mistakes they make is that they'll often advocate a successful detection as success. I've never defined success as a successful detection. For me, success should be an attack that doesn't run. So for me, the null result, or the attack failing basically, is my measure of success. I then go ahead, I simulate the TTP, and it makes the analysis pretty simple. Either the attack's going to successfully execute or it's not. If it successfully executes, it means I'm missing some architectural elimination or some architectural constraints. I can make the remediations, and then I repeat the test in order to demonstrate that the attack will now fail. So that's the approach I like to apply to validate that my architectural controls are working. So one of the things is this begins to give us confidence that if we're making the argument that W script is disabled, we can use this to prove that we cannot execute a W script based attack. And then we know that our alerts are not dropping because our detections are failing to work. We know alerts are dropping because we've actually validated the architecture is holding against those classes of attacks. So the alerting is still there, but the trigger conditions that cause those alerts are now absent from the environment because of the architectural change we made. And this is part of how we start to approach a more validated form of silence within the environment. So kind of going back to the null result I mentioned in the last slide, for me, this is where evidence-based security really differs from traditional detection. And this is one of the things required to begin to make security behave a lot more like a real scientific discipline. In real scientific disciplines, the null result is one of the results always looked for as part of an experiment. It's what makes a measurement falsifiable, which is a key thing within a hard scientific discipline. And I think security needs to go more and more in that direction. So as part of my framework, we don't ask whether the alert fired. We're asking whether the attack step could still happen. And if the architectural constraints are working, the answer should be no. And because there's a successful architectural control does not produce an alert, a successful path erasure makes the attack step fail to execute. And this is the goal we're going for. So in evidence-based security, silence is not an assumption. It's an outcome that we're testing and proving for. No attack path means you have no alerts for things that used to formerly be on that path. And that's how you get your environment to be quieter and quieter over time. Now, in order to do this, one of the key things is you kind of have to know what you can subtract. So obviously, you can't turn off everything in an environment because there are things that business legitimately needs in order to operate. And this is where taking an analytics-based approach comes in handy. So I'm going to make the argument in my talk that the important question is not what we focus on today. Today, we're very concerned with what the attacker's doing. We keep trying to figure out all kinds of ways to identify new malicious behavior. And it's kind of an unwinnable problem. Because if you think about it, there's unlimited things an attacker could potentially do. It's kind of an unsolvable, open-ended problem space. It's infinite. But whatever the business actually needs to do is a finite problem space. No matter how complex your business is, there's only a limited number of actions that business actually needs to handle. So one of the things I think we should do is we need to start focusing more and more on mapping out what functions the business actually needs to operate and begin to take away anything that's not needed for the business to operate. But in order to do that, you do have to figure out what the business actually needs. And I'm very big on using a data analytics approach to accomplish that. So I'm very big on doing behavioral analytics. You use the behavioral analytics to figure out, who's using what and where, and that identifies various candidates for path erasure. So, for example, So you'll find in most organizations, a browser never needs shell, or a nursing workstation might not need SSH, where somebody in IT probably does to log into a switch. You begin to map out where different behaviors are needed in the environment, and you can figure out where you can take those same functions away from. So it becomes a internal data analytics problem rather than an external threat intelligence type problem. So the process I like to use is, first you begin to monitor the real behavior that the users use within the environment. And you can turn a lot of the tools you already own into methods for doing this. So for example, most companies will have things like EDR, they'll have a SIM. Just like you can do detection engineering for a malicious threat, you can do detection engineering for internal business processes. You'll have to make custom detections, but you can use some of the same skills to actually map out and do the analytics for what you need to do. So you can build like, IOAs and CrowdStrike or SentinelOne, build those kind of custom detections to figure out how different applications are used. And you can do that kind of mapping, and based on what you find, you can classify things into this is required for the business, or this is unused, or maybe only some people use it. We'd be grouping it. So, IT needs SSH, nurses or salespeople do not. And from there, you can figure out, which subtractions you want to make. And then once you make your subtractions, you go back to that evidence-based framework to do the validation that the subtraction was needed. So you can kind of fit the results of this into three things. Some functionalities are going to be required. Those are things that you constrain if you can, but those are things you have to keep, like the browser or Office. You're not going to be able to architecturally eliminate those, but you can put constraints around them. Some things are going to be contextual. That's like the example with the nurses not needing SSH, but IT needing SSH. So you can take away SSH from probably the vast majority of most environments, but leave it for people in IT or DevOps who may need it for their legitimate job function. And then certain things are completely unneeded. A lot of legacy protocols you might find that nobody in the organization is using when you do these types of analyses, and you can safely shut those protocols off. Those tend to be fairly easy wins. Now, one of the big things I've noticed over the years in doing this is that just as we talk about herd immunity for like populations in biology, the same thing kind of applies to cyber. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of organizations make is they kind of let perfect be the enemy of good. If something can't be universally blocked, they tend not to block it. But I think a more appropriate way to think is that if you can remove it from at least 70% of the environment, it's probably worth doing. It doesn't have to be perfect in order to starve an attacker of his optionality. So take like the SSH example. If we remove it from every workstation but the people who work in IT, it dramatically limits lateral movement potential for a potential attacker. Because the odds of them landing on an IT desktop versus a salesperson desktop are probably fairly slim from an overall percentage of user base. Not impossible, but it lessens the chance that initial access can go someplace. Even if the attacker was lucky enough to land on an IT desktop, and he laterally moves then to a sales desktop, it also slows down where he can go from there, because now he can't run the same script to move to the next desktop. So it's definitely worth doing, even if you can't have a perfect policy in place. The herd immunity benefit really does kick in after about 70% of functionality can be removed from the environment. And that's something worth considering. Now, one of the reasons I think this is the path forward is this kind of scales much better, this approach of eliminating attacker optionality through architectural constraints, than our current find and fix approach. So today we kind of have an endless triage loop of security remediation, where constantly we're getting vulnerability reports and we're applying a new round of patches to 2 weeks later have to repeat the process every time a new vulnerability comes out. And I'm not arguing you shouldn't patch. Patching is basic security hygiene. You should definitely patch. What I'm arguing for is that we need to begin to transition from taking a reactive approach to security, like relying on patches as a primary defense mechanism, and instead make architectural constraints our primary defense mechanism. So if you think about it, patching is by nature reactive. It has to occur, after code is written. It has to occur after testing. It has to occur after the patch is applied. Oftentimes it occurs after a 0 day already exists. Patching is by nature a very, very reactive way to approach security. If we put architectural constraints in, we can eliminate a lot of vulnerabilities from becoming a problem before they even appear by breaking the attack path required in order to reach the vulnerability or to escalate past the vulnerability. So I think this is important because one architectural change can remove thousands of exploit possibilities, as opposed to one patch which patches one device. Control efficacy improves even as defect count increases. Part of the history of this is when I developed that first zero trust implementation and started pushing for ways of measuring this, I did so largely because I worked in the healthcare system. And one of the issues in healthcare is medical devices are almost impossible to patch if they're legacy. So I needed an architectural approach to keep an environment secure where a good chunk of the environment could never be patched. And this was kind of the approach I took towards that. And approaches like this shift security efforts from backlog management to design optimization. So rather than becoming, figuring out, do I patch this before that? You start to look at things and which architectural change can I make to provide me the greatest reduction in attacker optionality. And I'll get to more of that in a bit because I have a metric that we're going to get to help classify that. So path erasure works in the world of infinite vulnerabilities because defects can grow faster than we can fix them, but we can collapse paths faster than new defects can appear. And, short of some kind of issue popping up or some kind of architectural drift, one of the nice things about path erasure is once you disable a legacy protocol or block something within an environment, it tends to stay blocked. So once a path is gone, it tends to stay gone. Now, one of the reasons I think this is very important is I think often today we make a lot of excuses as security professionals. We always talk about how sophisticated, threat actors are. You constantly hear, when an organization's breached, there was a sophisticated attack. Everything's passed off as a sophisticated attack. And I think this is kind of an excuse that wouldn't fly if we're ever to become a real field of engineering. And one of the things I talk about in my book is what I call the very sophisticated wind fallacy. Because if you consider like a different engineering discipline, like civil engineering, if a civil engineer builds a bridge and that bridge collapses, no one would tolerate the bridge collapsing because the wind was very sophisticated. Yet this is the excuse we use all the time in cybersecurity. And I think it's provably not true. And I think MITRE ATT&CK actually proves that. Because MITRE ATT&CK, if you think about it, every attack path in existence is pretty much a walk across different boxes in that particular matrix. So one of the things that we need to begin to do is we kind of need to begin to shut the window on that very sophisticated wind by crossing off those boxes within the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Not detecting them like we do today, but actually making those boxes functionally impossible wherever we can. So we need to move away from, looking at things as it's very sophisticated and come to the realization that MITRE ATT&CK proves that the vast majority of attacks are not sophisticated. They're known series of steps that are well documented, well understood, and completely erasable. So to kind of hit that point a little harder, the question I always get is, what about 0 days? And I think the same thing applies to 0 days. If you break the attack path, you break the attack path that 0 day needs too. Consider something like Log4j. That was, a very devastating 0 day for a lot of organizations. It was a, very pervasive library. The exploit came out before the patch, but if we had taken an attack path based approach to those particular systems and we had egress filtering in place, now suddenly Log4j was a lot less of a big deal for organizations with egress filtering because the outbound LDAP communication required for the exploit to actually execute would have been blocked, and it made the 0 day pretty much the 0 day exploit executable. So you kind of shut the door before it even had a chance to become a problem. And I think we need to kind of shift more and more to approaches like this. We need to use architectural constraints to get rid of those mundane steps that every attack goes through, 0 day or not. So one of the approaches I like to use to do this at scale is a metric that I introduced recently called the Path Erasure Rate. So what Path Erasure Rate is, it's a metric that measures structural risk removal. It's basically a measurement of attacker optionality. And it looks at architectural efficacy, not activity. It ignores CVE counts, it ignores patch velocity, it ignores alert volume completely. And one of the interesting things is this is a leading metric, not a lagging one. If we think about most security metrics, they don't actually measure security directly. They measure activity around security. How many things do we patch? How many alerts do we process? How fast do we detect something? How fast do we respond? None of those actually measure security. They measure the activity around security. So my whole thing is that progress is about fewer reachable attack paths and not, fewer findings, not more activity. We need to start looking at the architecture overall and reducing the number of attack paths within the organization. And my metric for doing this is the Path Erasure Rate. So what it does is it looks at the total number of attack paths within the organization compared to the ratio of attack paths that we were able to eliminate within the organization. And the higher we can get this ratio, the closer we can get it to be to 100, the more secure the organization is because the less attacker optionality there is. This is a conceptualized version of the metric to make it easy to understand. If anybody's interested, the link at the bottom of the slide has the more in-depth mathematical breakdown of this that goes into the graph theory behind it. But conceptually, you're looking at the total number of attack paths in the organization in a ratio with the number of attack paths you erase. And the more of those you get rid of, the more architecturally secure you are. And I believe this correlates well with something I call the law of subtractive risk, which I think will one day become one of the first laws of quote unquote cybersecurity physics. Essentially, I'm arguing that security improves fastest by removing attack paths and not by adding more and more reactive controls. So if we want to make security of organizations better, we need to stop adding more smoke detectors and add more fireproof bricks to the environment. So one of the things is I believe that the architectural risk for an organization is inversely proportional to your path erasure rate. So in other words, the closer you get that path erasure rate to 100, the more attack paths you eliminate, the lower your architectural risk is going to be within the environment. So this pushes for shifting the focus back to that hierarchy of efficacy, more and more focus on architectural controls, and relegating the detection response type focus we have today to something that's still important, but something that should not be our primary defense, rather our tertiary level of defense. Because fewer paths is always going to beat faster reaction. Because if something can't execute, you can't react to it faster than that. So kind of the quietest environments are actually going to be the safest under this paradigm, because the more and more of those paths you get rid of, the more alert triggers you get rid of, the quieter the environment comes. And again, we know the silence is validated because we're proving the null result as part of that evidence-based efficacy testing. Okay. So in the science of silence, we don't measure security by alerts or dashboards or investigations or activity. We measure security by attacker actions that are no longer possible. We're going for that reduction in as much attacker optionality as possible. And to kind of sum things up, I think this slide does a great job. The whole focus on path erasure is you take the before side, and this is where most orgs are today. You have way too many roads because there's legacy protocols turned on. There's all kinds of excessive permissions. There's all kinds of shadow IT and unnecessary services and service accounts. But if you begin to apply the path erasure approach, you eliminate a lot of those roads. There's a lot fewer ways to get into the organization. Once you're in the organization, there's less attacker optionality for an attacker to move through the organization. And the big benefit of this goes back to that needle in the haystack argument we talked about earlier. On the left side and the before side, you need many police cars. You need a huge SOC. You need a lot of tools to find something that's going wrong. If you erase a lot of the roads, you have a lot less alerts going off, It's a much, much higher fidelity signal. The signal to noise ratio is significantly better after path erasure. So when an alert goes off, it probably really means something as opposed to, the thousands of false positives SOCs deal with today. It makes detection response work a lot better too. And I'll end with some additional resources and happy to take any questions.